Listen, I don't want to hear it. I already know how late I am. I really don't need to hear it. But anyways, approximately 2 weeks ago, there was a director's take talking about opening up the conversation on 5v5 and 6v6. Everyone was excited about this. Ever since the dawn of Overwatch 2, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people who are OGs of Overwatch have complained about, yo, this 5v5 stuff is not working. Bring back 6v6. And now I'm assuming Aaron Keller specifically has finally come to address that. So we're gonna, talk about it. Hey, hello, what's up, whatever. It's your new boy Les, and welcome to a new video. And if you're new, welcome to the channel. So this director's take is quite long, so I'm just gonna sum up some of the parts that I'm gonna talk about essentially, or quote the pieces that I find pretty relevant. So the article kind of does this build up to the actual conversation of 6v6, and I think it's quite important to take some of the stuff that is said from the stepping stones of before they talk about 6v6. If you haven't played Overwatch 2, they have a whole historical context heading, which basically just says hey, in the beginning of the game, this is how things used to be, and here were the major changes of the game. One of those major changes being this hero limits. So basically you could have theoretically 6 Genjis or 6 Reinhardts in one team, and obviously they changed that. Then they imposed a limit of having 1 of each hero per team, so you could only have 1 Genji, 1 Reinhardt in a team. This was implemented pretty early on in development, or early on into the release of the game, and the reason why they originally had it on was because they didn't have that many heroes as they claim, so it was pretty necessary to allow duplicate heroes at the time. And I think also another reason, if I remember correctly, is that it made balancing heroes super duper hard, because now you could have 6 Reinhardts on one team. Now how are we gonna have it so that 6 Reinhardts are not as powerful, you know what I mean, and they can't turn the tide, you know what I'm saying, but also have it so that if there's 1 Reinhardt, it could do just as much, a lot of factors in terms of why they had to do that. Now I'm gonna quote this one, but the second large change to the game's format was the move from open queue to role queue, which limited team compositions to 2 heroes from each role. Before role queue, there was no enforced 2-2-2 team composition, and players had the freedom to select any role they liked once they loaded into a match. With open queue, teams had a lot of freedom of choice about what heroes and team compositions to play, but there was quite a few problems with that role queue intended to address. Prior to implementing role queue, there was a stark imbalance in the number of people playing each role within each match. Damage was by far, and still is today, the most popular role, and tank was by far the least popular. In fact, seeing matches with 5 or even 6 damage players on each team was not uncommon. The more issues that came out from this was social issues, basically players trying to pressure other players to play other roles and other heroes, something that still exists in today's world, something as little as being yo, Roadhog switch to Reinhardt, it was basically that type of thing. And again, it made balancing super duper difficult because, there's a more billion amount of team compositions, and a lot of these team compositions can't really be accounted for when making general changes for heroes with specific kits like the ones we have in Overwatch. And apparently it also made introducing new heroes even more difficult, and apparently with kind of the same things that I mentioned earlier, and moving to role queue apparently was aimed to mitigate these challenges. Now role queue did at the time solve some issues like improving matchmaking overall, but it did have some downsides like longer queue times. Now the third major format change, which is super duper recent in terms of the lifespan of Overwatch, and I'm pretty sure we all know what it is, it was definitely the switch from 6v6 to 5v5. And now getting into the bread of butter why they switched to 5v5. Now to sum it up as best as I possibly can, the reasons why a lot of fights in 6v6 were resolved with ults, and while that is the same case with Overwatch 2 5v5, you can resolve a fight without having to wait to get certain ultimates or even certain abilities. 5v5 apparently has a greater emphasis on FPS gameplay. 5v5 gives more power to damage heroes by actually allowing their role to feel hey, I'm actually impactful and I'm doing something by shooting, Support heroes could be a little more independent by being able to do some damage, seeing as they're not having to account for, 4 other teammates to have to heal. Tank synergy in 6v6 wasn't always fun, and then a part of the article just kind of gives statistics on queue time data and context, basically saying yo, what are the queue times like for each role? And then we get to the crack of your mom's back, and we're finally at kind of the main point where, they're giving their thoughts on 6v6. And to be honest, I will read this whole thing actually. The game started its life with 6 players on each team. I discussed why we moved away from 6v6, but that doesn't mean it's without any merit. There were moments and madness that could happen with 12 players in a match that just don't quite coalesce when there are 10. It was almost too much to keep track of. Correction, it was too much to keep track of at times, but that was the part of the charm. There are big moments in Overwatch 2, but they don't quite have that same chaotic, over-the-top feeling to them. Part of the chaos that allowed players to feel less pressure in a match. There was an extra player to take up a bit of slack for someone that was performing poorly, and since that player was a tank, they had quite a bit of an impact. There were a lot more hit points and defense capabilities to burn through, which had stabilizing effect on gameplay. Teams would fold a bit slower than they do now. We went over some of the issues of tank synergy earlier, but having two of them allowed one to focus on protecting their backline while the other held ground or pushed into the enemy team. The tank role had a lot of depth in understanding how to work with the other tank on the team. This part of the mastery curve took a long time to learn, and for the small group of people devoted to it, that was part of its allure. We mentioned the difficulty in balancing tanks for 6v6 earlier, but the past year and a half has shown us that there are issues with balancing tanks for 5v5 as well. For much of Overwatch 2, tanks have been fairly balanced, but when one of them becomes a powerful outlier like Maga, that can be felt strongly in the world of one tank. In the what's next section, they basically just say like, yo, we're gonna be running a few game modes on 6v6, or rather series of events, that's what they call it, and they plan to introduce kind of the first part of the 6v6 thing in season 13. It's also pretty transparent in terms of why it may be a hard thing to implement in the current state of Overwatch. They bring up the fact of optimization, which I think is super duper important to point out. Bringing in another tank hero, or rather two tanks hero, considering a normal role queue game, you know, all those different effects and all those different things to account for can be taxing on just kind of the average PC. Performance can really have a large effect. They're also wary of queue times, because if they bring back 6v6, then there's most likely the chance that the queue times that were, you know, there before the game could probably come back, and I'm pretty sure we do not want longer queue times. And overall, to kind of fully implement it, if it does actually come to be of value, would take several seasons. But yeah, they're just overall hoping to get a lot of valuable information, and that is basically all that she wrote, or rather all that they wrote. There is a lot of information here. I did a pretty poor job at summing it up, I'm not gonna lie to you, but overall, what do I think about it? I mean, I'm open to it. Let me explain. So just for some backstory, I didn't really play a lot of Overwatch 1. I did get a copy of the game, and I clocked precisely around 25 hours in Overwatch 1. Like, I didn't really play it a lot, I'm gonna be honest with you. So I can't really give like a proper feedback in terms of how Overwatch 1 was. Like, I can barely remember what I even did. So maybe I do have some bias in terms of like, hey, but just the stories that I've heard from several people that I know, 6v6 wasn't exactly the greatest thing. But I think something that the article fails to outline was the potential that 6v6 did have, because apparently in the, you know, Overwatch 1's last few years before Overwatch 2 came into fruition and etc., the game was pretty much dead, and there was like a solidified meta, and apparently there wasn't like any balance changes like at all for the last few years. So that's why there was just like a running rampant like meta, you know. From what I've read, the article didn't exactly like point out like, hey, we didn't really in the last few years try and change anything up with the 6v6 meta. And I think that was something that they really should have pointed out and said like, that's something honestly on our part. But from the way that they make the article out to be, it seems like they've been struggling with tanks in 6v6 way before they just kind of gave up on it and tried to divert all resources to 6v6 PvE. In terms of how true everything in the first part is, or maybe not how true, but how much information is omitted in the first part of the article before it really dives into the 6v6 stuff, that I don't know. But in this case, I'm gonna just take their word for it, because that's the only word I really got to go off right now. I feel like 5v5 is the greater good. I mean, like, if they were struggling with tanks back in 6v6 and they're struggling with tanks now, then honestly, I think in terms of the overall greater good, 5v5 is definitely the way. I don't think 6v6 solves all the problems that the article addresses. Like earlier, they were mentioning queue times, which is actually something I forgot to point out. So they were mentioning like, yo, 6v6 queue times took forever, and 5v5 changed that drastically. Now, in terms of the casual player base, or maybe not casual, but average player base that isn't like in top 500 queues for over an hour, I can confidently say that like, yo, for the most part, the queues still feel long. I have had some days, or not some days, but some moments where I've been in queues for like over 10 minutes, well, specifically talking about competitive solo queuing. I mean, if I'm complaining about like 5 to 10 minute queues on maybe DPS, for example, I cannot imagine how bad it must have been casually playing Overwatch 1 with the little amount of players that they had, you know? I mean, but they do go and talk about, you know, the queue times in the current 5v5 and say that the queues are long. And I hope I'm quoting this right, but I think it's something about like 5v5 queues may seem long at times, mainly because there's not a lot of people queuing roles like tank or support. There's still a lot of people that queue up damage, and sometimes you may see like, oh, you should find a support game in like less than 2 minutes, right? But you see that like, oh wait, no, this queue took me like 6 minutes to find a game. And oftentimes because, you know, there's not other players in other roles able to fit the shoes, so that's why you may still be stuck in queue, because there, you know, there's not a lot of people queuing up tank, that type of thing. Okay, but like I said, I do think just overall 5v5 is the greater good. Like if we're having queues right now, and the reasoning that they give that like, yo, queue times are long because people aren't queuing all the different roles for role queue, right? It's just gonna be worse if it's 6v6, because if people aren't already queuing up tank enough to be like finding games in under a minute or even 2 minutes, then it's going to be much worse with 6v6 if we have like 2 tanks, 2 DPS, and 2 supports. I've seen a rise in popularity recently with support, and you know, shout out to the people who are actually now realizing that, oh my god, there's different roles in this game that I can have fun and learn how to play. But tank always gets like the short end of the stick. No one is interested in playing that role. So if there's not enough people to queue up playing one tank, imagine the queue times when it comes to 2 tanks. People will not find games for on average 3 minutes casual unranked game, and it's obviously going to be much worse for people who are in like top 500, those high ranks, your streamers like Flats, Emong, SK, etc, etc. They're just going to be more to complain about queue times. Now in terms of balancing, to be honest, I really am not sure, because the whole thing with 5v5 was individual agency, right? Like you're able to do a lot more by yourself, for yourself, etc, etc, and we've seen a lot more of these changes like employed throughout the game. You know, the self-healing thing, a lot of changes to existing heroes kits, like a lot of the tanks have changed a lot. Damn, even making Doomfist a tank as well, that's another huge change. You know, these are things that could easily become very powerful having a second tank. It's not simply just flipping a switch and then just turning 6v6 on. Let's be honest. Like, let's say Doomfist is still really suckish, because I don't really know the state of Doom right now, to be honest with you. But let's just say that he really sucks right now. Since the beginning of the game, he's always been a hero that's required a lot of skill to do the bare minimum. But if there was a second tank to be able to accommodate the Doomfist would easily shoot up and be like an S tier like hero to play if you actually learned how to play him. Because you know, you have the things with like his self-preservation, his shields, different CC abilities, goddamn his get out of jail free card, which is his ult, his block. I could see something like that becoming easily overpowered with a second tank being there ultimately. So that means Doomfist can just go and be like, oh, I don't really need to defend my team, just go bully backline while Bros is dealing with frontline, killing all frontline, and now backline feels pressure to be like, hey, I need to heal Bros, but I can't heal Bros because this Doomfist is on me and he's not leaving me alone. Another good example is Wrecking Ball. Wrecking Ball, his E, oh my lord. Like even now in games, he still feels very, not hard to kill, but it feels like a very tedious task to kill one Wrecking Ball already. So imagine he had a second tank to make up for his flak now. We have a lot of tanks that kind of like the jack of all trades. I think a good example is Ramatra. Ramatra has like a shield, you know, you can play around that. Ramatra has a different form, which allows him to block up to 75% of damage and be oppressive as hell as well. Ramatra has this pretty oppressive E, and his ult is absolutely insane. Now imagine there being just any second tank with Ramatra there. Yeah, that would be quite a bit, to be honest with you. So definitely another aspect, especially with tanks, is that I can see tanks shooting up to being one of the most powerful in the role with the implementation of just raw dogging 6v6 in our like battle nets, right? Like if Team 4 decided like, yo, we are dropping this tomorrow, we have not made any balance changes whatsoever, we just slapped in the 6v6, did all the code and stuff, but we made no balance changes whatsoever, tank would easily be overpowered and it would be a very unfun experience. And we we would almost decline back to what people complain about with 6v6, which was playing a specific meta of heroes and playing sort of like the long game, having to save up, you know, to get ults, and getting that ult would ultimately win the team fight. And to get to that point, that would take like a long time, because now it's like, okay, I want to combo this ult with you, that's the strat, and now you're on payload for like the past 2 minutes. So team fights would definitely be dragged on for a lot more longer. You know what, this article actually addresses everything the way that I'm thinking about it. Like, I'm literally kind of regurgitating this article. If we implemented 6v6 right now, no balance changes, we would literally roll back into the problems of what they were addressing with 6v6. But that's obviously in the case if they implemented it without actually balancing it. But I think it would be even much more harder to balance it, actually. Like, there would have to be a lot of soft reworks for a bunch of heroes if 6v6 was predominantly like the more popular game mode, for example, right? And they were like, yo, you know what? Let's get rid of 5v5, let's put in 6v6. There would ultimately have to be like soft reworks. Like, damn, there would actually have to be a lot of reworks, oh my lord. Because you have these tanks which, you know, can do everything, and nothing dies quite as quick anymore because there's so much to shoot, I guess, if that makes sense. Now you're dealing with 2 tanks. Now I am going to call out the article and say that like it did omit a lot of details. But like I said, I mean, this is a more biased, you know, opinion. I'm obviously leaning towards 5v5 because 5v5 is what I actually know. I've played a lot more Overwatch 2 than I have Overwatch 1, but from what I've read from the article and what I've heard from people, I just think that 5v5 is the better one, but not the best one. Some changes have, well, been interesting. The tank one is definitely a spot on one. It feels like tanks are either really super duper strong or kind of okay-ish. It's never really the in-between. The perfect example here is literally what they mentioned in the article, which was the Maga one. When Maga, you know, I think it was in this like 3-day trial, I think, and on release maybe, he was just like super duper powerful. If you weren't playing Maga, you were going to lose games. It sucked having to deal with Maga then. He was so strong. And I think that with the current tanks kits, that could definitely become a much more bigger problem with, you know, having 2 tanks now. Because a lot of like the tank like reworks and stuff was made so that the tanks could like have individual agency. You know, they didn't need a second tank to make up for things that that first tank couldn't do. And there's still a lot of tanks that still, you know, struggle with this. Reinhardt, admittingly. Playing Ryan is tough, and it's not necessarily the most ideal pick when you're going into comp. Overall, I am open to seeing how the 6v6, you know, several playtests go. I know a lot of people on Twitter have been crying for 6v6, saying that it's like the penultimate solution, and thinking about it just from a balancing standpoint in terms of the state of the game and balance of that, it's not really the best, well, decision. A lot of people would disagree with me on that take, and that's perfectly fine. I'm willing to hear your takes in the comments below, but I just personally think that 5v5 is the better pick here. It is not the greatest pick, sure. Tanks do struggle, and unfortunately there's a lot of toxicity when it comes to tanks. I mean, just playing tank just sucks overall. I'm not gonna lie to you. Overall, like I said, 5v5, I think it should be here to stay, but I'm very open to 6v6. I'm just interested in terms of how they're going to balance every hero for these 6v6 playtests, and I hope that Overwatch players don't take advantage of this just to bring back 6v6 and actually give like informative decisions and be like, oh yeah, no, this patch was very mid, you should make changes like this and this, and you know, they take in the feedback, implement it, blah 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 blah. That's what I'm overall hoping for. But yeah, I think that's really all I have to say. So if you have enjoyed this video, then please do leave a like, that'd be greatly appreciated if you do want to, of course. And also, if you're going to check out my videos or past streams or whatever the case may be, then please do subscribe, that'd be greatly appreciated if you do want to, of course. I think there's a lot of issues with Overwatch 2, I'm not going to deny it, but I don't think that 6v6 will be the penultimate solution or like the solution of the roots of all of it, you know what I mean? I'm definitely happy that, you know, the team there is really open to, you know, all of this and is willing to actually give it a shot. Me personally, I wouldn't do that. But that's just me though. I do have a Twitter and I do have an Instagram, links in description. I do have a goal of trying to ratio Mr. Beast over there on Twitter, and in order to do that, I'm going to need more followers over there, and in order to get more followers over there, I'm going to need more subscribers over here, so you know exactly what to do. What do you think about the director's take? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Why? I'm a wee bit tired, so my take wasn't exactly a take that I'm happy with, but are you happy with my take? Are you unhappy with my take? Do you agree? Do you disagree with what I said? If so, why? What do you prefer more, 5v5, 6v6? Why? What issues issues do you think should have been covered by the team that you'd feel like hasn't really been spoken or spoken enough? What color's your hair? Anything that you possibly have to say, you can put it down in the comments below and I'll probably acknowledge it. And you know what it is, guys. Peace.